All right, welcome to the third lecture of the week about self and self-presentation. I would classify this reading as the single most important reading of the semester in terms of understanding identity and how it works on a sort of conceptual level, or how the perspective of the class, of the course, views identity, self and self-presentation. So if you haven't done so, please give this a thorough reading before watching this lecture and going on in the course. It should be a very much referenced guide as you are working on final papers and as you're sort of developing ideas about the course. Now, some of the reading pertained specifically to sports fans, but most of the reading was really just a social psychological approach to understanding identity. So hopefully you see it as useful in terms of the class itself, but I'd really like you to find this to be useful for just understanding how identity works in every aspect of life, not just sports. All right, so let's get into it. One of the first concepts we need to talk about is the self schema. So here, this is a combination of social identities, of the sort of roles that we can play or that we're choosing to play, personal qualities, and then generalizations that we're making about ourselves. So what kind of person am I? All of these add up to give us an idea of an objectified self. So if we're looking at ourselves in the mirror, what are we seeing? What types of personalities, what kind of person are we? So when we think about ourselves in the abstract, sort of an out-of-body type of experience where we're reflecting back on ourself, what do we think of when we think of ourself and our identity? That's really what a self-schema is. A schema is really just sort of a categorization. So we have schemas about just about everything in society. So we have a schema about a table. We have a schema about college. We have a schema about a professor or any professor. We have schemas about sports, how they're supposed to work, how they operate, fairness. All of these are just sort of categories that we instantly access as a sort of a mental shortcut. So we don't have to sort of deeply think about every single thing individually. We just sort of mentally access our schema on, okay, that's how a table functions. I don't need to look at this specific table and get the details about it, or this is how sports are supposed to function, or this is how a professor is supposed to function in a classroom, in a lecture environment. This is how a website's supposed to function. Again, schemas can be about anything, and really they're just mental shortcuts for helping us understand the world around us, so we don't have to spend so much of cognitive energy on trying to dissect every single thing that we come across. And building off this self schema is where we start to get reflexive action. So when I think about me, so I is the thing that does actions. Me is the object of the action. So thinking about a subject, I, acting and doing things in the world, and an object, me, things happen to them, having that sort of separation in the mind. So if I do this, this will happen to me as an object. So the I-me split is really based on having a self-schema mixed in with our own sort of impulses and desires and actions that we try to put forth into the world. And it's this split between I and me that allows us to take on different roles and to view ourselves or try to view ourselves in a way that society would view us. So it's the objectification of the self, creating a me. And here's where we can start taking on roles. So how does the world view a mail carrier, a firefighter, a police officer? I would perform those, the subjective self, but those roles are viewed by the world in sort of certain ways. There's a schema for a mail carrier, a firefighter, a police officer. So all of those roles that we might take on are objects of people's impressions or understandings. So this separation of the I and the me within the self, the subjective self and the objective self, allows us to take on these roles. In childhood, we even see that children sort of play with roles, taking on roles in a game of playing house or playing school or on a team, taking on different roles and sort of playing with the idea of, all right, I can be these different things, and here are the consequences of being a teacher in playing school, or a student, or a good student, or a bad student, or a leader on the team, or just sort of one of the members of the team, or a bad teammate. All these different roles that we can take on sort of as we're developing our identity and trying to play with our identity to figure out who we are. And again, it goes back to, how does the world view these things? And we can step outside of ourselves and view sort of looking back at ourselves like, okay, this is me in this role of a firefighter. This is me in this role of a professor or of a student or of a boyfriend or girlfriend. And all of these roles, we look back sort of on ourselves and think about the characteristics and the values and sort of the performance of self. And all of these taking on roles and sort of playing with identity develop over the years what's called a generalized other. So all of this is based on feedback from other people. So if we are performing a certain role, let's say we're being a good student, and our teacher gives us a smile and a congratulations and a good job, or our mom and dad give us a good boy, good girl kind of response, or we get good grades and we feel good about ourselves. All of that feedback builds into a generalized other. And really this is about expectations. So what sorts of behaviors do we want to perform to get certain and what expectations do we have regarding other people's response to those behaviors? So with the generalized other, we know that, all right, if I'm really nice to somebody, generally speaking, they're happy with my performance, they're happy with the relationship, they treat me well. If I'm really mean to somebody, I get negative feedback and they don't like me and they're mean to me and I don't get things that I want. If I am a good student, I know that I can expect these certain responses to come. If I'm a sort of a civil servant or a firefighter or a police officer, I know I can expect these types of responses in general from people. So it can be based on roles that we take on as well as individual behaviors that we take on. But when we perform these behaviors, it's always sort of in the back of our mind, okay, what's going to be the response to this? What's going to be what's the audience or what's the person across the table likely to respond to this behavior? And that thought in the background is really the generalized other. We have generalized others for sort of strangers in society, our thoughts about a stranger in society. So much of this is contextualized. We have a generalized other for sitting in a classroom. So if I raise my hand and say this, what's likely going to be the reaction around the classroom? What's likely going to be the reaction from the professor? Same thing if we're sitting in a house of worship. If I stand up and start shouting, what's going to be the likely reaction from the religious leader at the front or the rest of the congregation? And you can think about just any sort of context that you might be in. It might be a job setting or a job interview. What types of expectations do I have in terms of like a generalized other for behavior in this room? So if I start talking about something that's way off base and not related to the job, what kind of response or reactions should I expect from this other person across the table? And those expectations are all based on this generalized other, which is built up over years and years and years of experiences with people. Positive feedback, negative feedback, roles that we've taken on, and the responses that we've been given by the people that are around us, behaviors that we've performed, and the responses that we've been given, the feedback that we've been given based on those performances. All of that adds up over the years to this generalized other that we use as kind of a sounding board. Like, all right, if I do this behavior, what's likely going to be the outcome? Or if I choose to say this, what's likely going to be the outcome? All of that's based on this generalized other that we have out there. A challenge with the online environment is that when we remove physical context, it takes away a lot of sort of clues that we might have about a generalized, or assumptions perhaps that we have about a generalized other. So if we are interacting with people online, we never know what sort of where they're at on the other end. So if it's a performance that we are doing maybe at a party, but the person on the other end watching it a few days later online might be just watching it from their living room and not sort of in the context of a party. So then the behaviors really don't make sense. The self-performance is still very much reliant on feedback and making adjustments based on feedback. But there's a lack of nonverbal cues. There's sort of asynchronous communication going on. And there's some norms about social media that generally have us avoid negativity. Unless it's a celebrity doing something, then we're plenty negative. But if it's just a friend that's doing something that's sort of out of the ordinary, that if you were there in the moment, you might call them on, If it's in social media, you're less likely to have sort of this public shaming or anything like that. So there's some different dynamics happening in the online environment. And I would like to note that at the time of the publication of this article that you guys read, or the book chapter that you guys read, is a very different sort of online world. It's from a while ago that doesn't necessarily have the same structures that a lot of our social media have now, where we know the people that we're friends with online. Early on in the days of the internet, it was very much sort of an anonymous chat room type of social media. It wasn't Facebook friends or Instagram friends with the people that you actually know. It was all sort of anonymous types of behaviors, which allowed sort of identity play and freedom, but that's just not the world that we occupy now. So it is in some ways potentially a sort of a greater freedom in identity performance, but in many ways it's still very much grounded in your offline connections, your offline friends. So there isn't that sort of the deep freedom that maybe early online users had. All right, so far we've developed a self schema, kind of how we think about ourselves based on what we are generally seeing from responses from those around us, based on kind of a generalized other. So let's take that self-evaluation a little bit further. Again, it's largely reliant on what we perceive others think about us. So it's really a perception. So if we're generally receiving positive feedback, we have a positive self-view. So do this more. Whatever we're doing that's getting positive feedback, our self-evaluation is like, all right, this seems to be working. Let's keep doing this. So that's generally sort of a reinforcement type of theory where do well in school, get a reward, let's do more of it. Same thing for negative feedback, or just the opposite rather. For negative feedback, we tend to have a negative self-view or negative evaluation of ourselves. Like, all right, whatever I'm doing here doesn't seem to be working. I need to change up and try something different. So if we're in the middle of a conversation, maybe on a first date, and we can tell by a lot of the nonverbal cues that it is not going well, we might try to do something different. Or we could just sort of cut bait and move on. More than likely, though, we're going to at least try a couple times to change our behaviors or change sort of what we're talking about or how we're acting, to try to move toward positive self-view or positive feedback. And again, this feedback comes in every context that we walk into in life. We take on certain roles. So in that first date example, the role identity is sort of either male or female trying to move to a second date or getting to know somebody. A lot of times our role identities early on in relationships are about sort of the job we have, where we're from, what we're studying in school, those types of knowable kind of identities that are like, okay, he's a student, he's from Indianapolis, he wants to go into this type of career, easily identified and easily understood identities, leaving some of the deeper stuff maybe to future conversations. So the first date example is maybe a bit of a challenge because we're really trying to get to know the person, maybe in a deeper fashion. Other contexts are not so focused on getting to know the person. There, it's more of a functionality. So if we show up to class, we have very defined roles. So the professor's at front, going to provide some sort of content to the class. Each student is performing his or her role as well. But when we leave the academic setting, maybe we're at a job place and we have a very specific role in the hierarchy within the job. And we have a boss, we have maybe subordinates, and everybody has sort of a role to play. And those role identities are, in some cases, very powerful and lend a lot of structure to the context that you're in. In other places, maybe the role identities aren't so formalized, and then there's maybe a loose structure going on. So again, a lot of it depends on the context that you're in. The context that you're in many cases, defines the role that you are playing in that context. Now, in some cases, your identity is based on the groups that you belong to. This is called social identity. So rather than specific roles that you play within a context, it's more of larger, I belong to this group. And this might be where sports comes in most easily, or is most easily understood. So I am a fan of the LA Lakers. I'm a fan of the Yankees, or whatever the sports team might be. And that's sort of the group that you define yourself by. And then your identity is moved a little bit outside of yourself, or at least the values and the characteristics are move a little bit outside of yourself, and are largely governed by the group, or understood at least as sort of, okay, you're a member of that group. Here's what that group's values are. Okay, and I'm going to apply those values to you and assume that you have those same characteristics and those same standards. That's sort of your mode of operation is based on that social identity. So social identity groups can really be anything. It can be a group of Hoosiers. It can be a group of Butler professors, Butler students. It can be a group of anything. It can be a group of firefighters. It can be a group of dentists. And as long as that's what the social identity is, that's sort of at the fore, that's what's on someone's mind, and they treat you and interpret you and understand you based on that identity, that's sort of what governs the interaction. So then it's important to understand what characteristics are there that will govern the interaction, again, like I said, but also where those characteristics come from. In some cases, they come as a reference to other groups, so out groups. Easily understood in terms of fans of, I'm a fan of Oklahoma, definitely not a fan of Texas in terms of college sports. But these characteristics are sort of, they need to be continually reaffirmed or reshaped by the practices of the group members. In many cases, strong leaders or trendsetters within the group have a disproportionate amount of influence over the group and over the characteristics or the defining qualities of the group. But all members are sort of representatives of the group when that social identity is at the fore in whatever context that you're in. So places that a sports-related social identity would be at the fore would be when fans attend the NFL draft. Their identity is Cowboys fans or Eagles fans or Giants fans. When you're at a bar wearing a uniform, watching teams play, your social identity is Packers fan. Anytime that it's a sort of a sporting-related event and you are easily identified as one group member. So the people that show up to the NFL draft, for example, they are sort of regular citizens, I'm guessing, on Monday through Friday. They have jobs, they're carpenters or dentists and teachers and bus drivers and everything else. So they have a number of other identities. They're fathers and sons and wives and daughters. They have all sorts of other identities going on, but again, it's what's at the fore, what's most salient for this context. And the social identity that's most salient at the NFL draft is the sports fan identity. So let's touch base on this self-schema concept one more time, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The self-schema is sort of our general thoughts about ourself. The same thing we do about other people. So we have a schema for our significant others. We have a schema for our parents. We have a schema for just about everyone that we come across. But the self-schema is sort of a way to reflect on the self and sort of who am I? So if you've ever had sort of a moment of clarity of like, this isn't me, why am I doing this? You're thinking about your self-schema. The this isn't me is requires you to have a self-schema to know sort of what me is. And once we have our self-schema established, which usually happens somewhere in kind of those teen angst years when we're trying to figure out who we are, once we have our self-schema established, which happens, again, pretty early on, then everything after that is really enacting who we are. So clothing, behaviors, attitudes, relationships. I use the word signage for sort of the things we keep around us, bumper stickers, posters, wall decor, anything you have sort of in your bedroom. Think of that as signage of an enactment of your self-schema, of your identity. Now, this self-schema certainly evolves over the years. So in your teen angst years, 13, 14, you probably start to get a sense of self, but that certainly develops and evolves over time. So as you move through high school and eventually into college, you might transition your identity to something else. Once you start getting into the workforce, your identity often gets tied up with the job that you have. And as you sort of move out of the early 20s, you start doing jobs, start doing family, and the identity continues to shift toward father or mother, spouse, and again, like the job that you take on. And this might also be where maybe sports is starting to transition as well. So maybe you move from participant in sports in early years, high school, maybe even into college. But eventually, at some point, you move away from being a participant and you're moving into a fan base, or more, and a greater extent into a fan base. You could have been a fan all along, of course, but away from participant to solely being a fan might be a shift in your self schema. And we actually see for a lot of professional athletes, after they retire, go through a lot of sort of psychological issues, oftentimes like depression, anxiety, because this self schema is forcibly switched away from being, this is who I am, this is my identity, to, all right, I can still kind of be around sports, but I am no longer the quarterback of the football team. That's just never going to happen again. So in many ways, it feels really like an identity shakeup for former athletes right at that moment of transition where I'm no longer an athlete. That's not my identity anymore. A similar fashion could happen if people are fired from a job. It typically doesn't happen sort of as much at the far back end of a long career. So if you're in your 60s and you make the choice to retire, you're already sort of transitioning your identity, and it's more of a voluntary transition of an identity rather than being fired or being cut by a pro team where it's sort of a forced transition of identity and you don't want it to happen. So again, whenever the self schema evolves, when it's our choice, it tends to go pretty well. But when it's a forced change, that's really when our identity and our sort of sense of self gets a real sort of shock to the system. So when the text moves into the concept of the situated self, it is thinking of that self schema, so how we think about ourselves, but what elements in that are governed by context and identity salience. That's really what's driving how we act in any given setting. So if we're at the game, it might be that our social identity that's drawn out is our sports fandom, or if we're at a job interview, the identity that is sort of most salient is the major that we're in, maybe a little bit of our professional background. If we're in class, our identity is student. If we're at the bar, our identity might be any number of things, whatever we're trying to play up. We usually try to play to our strengths in social settings. So if you have a really high status job, you might try to play that up and dress up a little bit and look the part. If you're maybe an athlete and want to play up that, you might dress in a manner that shows off sort of your physical strength. Other situations govern, the context is really governing identity presentation. So if you're at a funeral, all of these other types of identities don't really matter as much. Everybody tries to sort of downplay themselves. You wouldn't want to dress up and like show off a great job that you have while you're at a funeral. You'd really want to try to be as low key as possible in general. And so the context itself drives it more than maybe identity salience at that point. So depending on the setting, it really goes in any number of directions on what's sort of most important or what you're trying to accomplish in each given setting. So in most settings, we have kind of a balance of control happening. We have some freedom to choose which groups we belong to. We can be a Yankees fan or a Red Sox fan, or we can choose what major we go into in college, and to some extent we get to choose what our profession is or what our job is. And we have ability to some extent to switch groups. If for whatever reason being a member of a certain group or identifying with a certain group becomes undesirable, we can switch. If we're maybe working for a company that there's maybe a scandal or something happens that we no longer want to be affiliated with, or if we're at an institution or a college that we don't want to be a part of anymore, we can switch, and our identity gets switched along with that. But there are many things in social contexts that are out of our control. So the groups that we belong to is not always such a free choice. Race, and to some extent sex and gender, socioeconomic status, those types of things are, for the most part, pretty stable. And we can certainly make some adjustments, but it's a very sort of difficult task to make adjustments to those kind of demographic type of variables. Additionally, when we are in whatever groups we're in, there's a pressure to perform according to standards, according to the social norms of that identity, especially if it's a social identity. We have to sort of be the standard bearer when we're in a group. Oftentimes, this comes out in a way of asking to be, or of people asking us to speak on behalf of a minority community or on behalf of a social identity group that we belong to, and we end up being the spokesperson for that entire group, fairly or unfairly, and whether we like it or not, that often happens. So we talked earlier a little bit about sort of what happens when an athlete retires and kind of the identity challenge that he or she faces. And identity gets challenged at many moments in our life. Often, sort of the down times is what is a result of an identity challenge. Excuse me. So the loss of a relationship, especially if it was unwanted, if you got dumped, we get knocked down in terms of our identity because we thought we had sort of this solid identity of partner in this relationship, and then that gets removed, and a big sense of who we were was that identity, and it got taken away. This is oftentimes why we see a rebound relationship happen, to sort of give a boost back up to self-esteem and self-identity. We put ourselves right back into another relationship, just to sort of give our identity kind of an easier transition. Other examples come when we get fired, when we lose a job, not necessarily a voluntary leaving of a position or a retirement, but when we are cut loose and are no longer the identity that we had been just the day before. Sports fans losing oftentimes comes with an identity ding. So we get we feel worse about ourselves. We feel worse about our intellectual abilities, our physical attractiveness, our intelligence. And to cope with that, we always sort of try to find places to find hope. So the whole mentality of next year is built around this identity preserving type of behavior, or looking forward to the draft, saying, well, we have these guys that were pretty good. Plus, we have a top 5 draft pick. Looks like we're going to be really good. We have some maybe cap space that we can do a lot of things in free agency, or there's new recruits if we're talking about a college team, new recruits coming in, or JUCO transfers coming in that will really give us a boost next year, or these underclassmen that will be 1 year better. Will really be good next year. So it's always sort of finding hope despite losing. And this same type of hope seeking is related to any identity ding, or anytime our identity gets knocked down. So if we get dumped, our friends usually rally around us. And if they're like, oh, you'll find somebody better, it'll make you even happier. It's worth going through all of these terrible relationships to find your special one at the end of it all. Or if you lose a job, people are like, oh, you'll find a better job. This will be for the best. Those types of sentiments are all really about building hope and kind of restoring the identity that was knocked down. And that brings us to our third discussion item for this series of lectures. Please take a moment to pull up your discussion post and talk about a time where your identity took a hit. Failure at work or school or sports or relationships, whatever it might be. Talk a little bit about what happened and think about it in terms of identity, and sort of in relation to this lecture. Do you recall what you did to get it back up, to give your identity sort of a boost? Was there a temporary sort of filling of the void? What ultimately led to kind of the identity recovery? Describe what happened, who helped, and what ultimately was successful in getting your self-esteem back up and running. Take a few moments now, head over to your discussion post, and then come on back. Returning now to the self-schema concept and when other things can go wrong. So some is when your identity gets sort of a ding based on something happening to you. You get dumped, you get fired, things like that. Other problems come when you see discrepancies in your ideal self, your self-schema, and your behaviors that don't match what you want to be. So some of these might be when you make a mistake and you feel guilty, or when you do something that you know that you shouldn't have done, sort of that's not me kind of mentality. Why did I do this? If you did behaviors that were bad for if you're a bad partner, if you're a bad parent or a child, a bad student, and you know that that's not who you want to be. All of this really results in cognitive dissonance, which is just a scientific way of saying guilt. So your actions and your attitudes don't necessarily line up. Your attitudes about yourself and what you want to be don't match up with the actions that you performed, resulting in cognitive dissonance. So on the opposite side of self-discrepancies, where we have cognitive dissonance, or when we suffer blows to our identity by a loss of job or loss of relationship, we have self-esteem. So we can have a high self-esteem when, generally speaking, the things in our social or in our self-schema are up and running, and they're running well. So we have a lot of our identity gets kind of placed on a handful of areas. So job, financial success, if we're productive and deserving of esteem, if that's going well, it gives our self-esteem a boost. If physically we feel fit and attractive and healthy, that can be a sense of or a place of self-esteem boost. Relationships, family life, partners. If we feel worthy of love, that can be a big self-esteem boost. And if in general we are sort of winning at whatever aspects of life we feel is sort of somewhere we're really putting a lot of energy and maybe a lot of competitive energy, if that works for us, that could be a self-esteem boost. So all of those, if all of those are working, you should have a really high self-esteem. But we typically tend to focus in on what we think is most important to us and put a lot of self-esteem there. So if our job is just kind of a job, we might not necessarily put a lot of value on that. And our self-esteem could be more based on relationships or more based on maybe other elements of life, or our physical health and our physical sort of fitness might be an important self-esteem measure for our life. Or it might be the other way, where our health and fitness aren't as important to us. Our relationships might not even be important to us, but we're really focused on our job and we put a lot of our identity in our job. So we have some options, but generally speaking, our sort of main categories of life are our sources of self-esteem, and it's up to us to kind of figure out where we want to draw the most esteem. All right, guys, just a few slides to go. I know this is kind of a beast to get through all this stuff, but again, stuff that I find that it's critically important to understanding identity, so just bear with me. A few slides to go. So one practice that we all partake in is protecting our self-esteem. So in some cases, it comes in the form of selective information processing. So that's kind of a fancy way of saying see no evil, hear no evil. We just try not to even open ourselves up to hearing bad things. So if it's maybe something on the TV that we don't want to hear about our fan base or our team, we simply turn it off. Don't listen to it. Don't pay attention to it. Some other tactics include selective social comparison. So I used to live in the state of Alabama, and I would always laugh about how much Alabama compares itself to Mississippi, but this is really selective social comparison. So in terms of like state education or obesity or any athletic teams, any number of ways, Alabama can compare itself to Mississippi, and it's always sort of the selective social comparison. They pick Mississippi because Mississippi, generally speaking, in the categories that Alabamians focus on anyway, Mississippi doesn't perform as well. If Alabama looked at its sort of education status as a state compared to all of the states in the United States, Alabama doesn't do so well. But if it just compares itself to Mississippi, Alabama has done pretty well. And the final way of protecting our self-esteem is through selective commitment to our identities. So we might think of this as kind of a casual Yankees fan isn't really fully bought in those seasons where the Yankees maybe aren't doing so good. But when the Yankees make it to the World Series, they're absolutely presenting themselves as the biggest and proudest Yankee fan in the history of the world. Yankees are maybe a bad example. They've had enough success in the past over the past couple decades. Maybe like the Royals or the Cubs, teams that haven't won for a long time and were riding some very recent success, and the fans are coming out of the woodwork. There's just so many Kansas City Royals fans that are claiming to be lifelong, diehard Kansas City fans, but were always kind of quiet, and you maybe never even knew that they were a Kansas City Royals fan until the Royals start winning a championship or start having a championship run. So that sort of selective commitment to identities not not necessarily the most loyal of fans, but just kind of just tuning out during the bad years, not really caring, not investing a lot of your identity or your time or energy into being a fan, but then really coming out when the team starts doing well and playing up that identity for the sort of the identity boost or the self-esteem boost that comes from being a fan of a winning team. So all of this adds up to what a scholar named Goffman called impression management. So this is, we desire control over how others see us. So we manage the impression that other people get, or we try to at least. Most of the time, impressions are more of out of our control, but we do what we can to manage the impression. So think of this as maybe going on that first date or going on a job interview. You're really trying to do impression management work there. So you dress the part, you sort of behave in a certain manner. For a job interview, think of all the things that would go into the prep for it. You learn as much as you can about the company, about the job. You might do research on the person that's interviewing you. You certainly dress the part and come sort of ready with your A game. That's all impression management. We want to amplify the things that we think are in our favor and minimize the things that we think are maybe casting us in a bad light. So then finally, when behaviors go awry, this is really where our impression management efforts have failed in some manner, where we get caught not being who we say we are. So we're trying to give a certain impression, but somebody sees like, oh, okay, that's how you really are. I see what's happening over there behind the curtain. Sometimes it's a genuine mistake in behaviors, and we didn't mean to do something bad. Sometimes it's a misinterpretation. Other times it's simply getting caught, sort of giving a false presentation of trying to show that you're maybe really wealthy, but someone finds out that you're dirt poor. Generally speaking, when it's sort of an honest mistake, people help us get back on track. So if we're late for work, people sort of will help. It's kind of a team effort almost, in like, oh, traffic was bad this morning. There was an accident on the south side, weather, kids, whatever other excuse happens. Generally speaking in life, people work in this sort of team identity work mentality of trying to help people sort of get back on track. Like, yeah, you did this bad thing, but you're still a good person. There's other reasons why this bad thing happened. In some cases, if it's sort of a large enough grievance, and simply saying, I'm sorry, I did it, it's my bad, sort of the mea culpa. You have maybe a temporary shame of, I'm sorry, what can I do to fix this kind of thing? But eventually the team welcomes you back to the fold. If it's a severe misbehavior, in some cases, there's sort of the shaming isn't enough. There might be sort of banishment or exclusion from a social group. Usually it doesn't get this far, only for the most sort of egregious of mistakes or crimes would this happen. Most of the stuff in everyday life is kind of that level one. We just make excuses for each other and keep everything moving forward. And with that brings to the end this long lecture. Thanks for bearing with me through it all. I know it's about 40 minutes, but again, I really think the content is that critical that it was worth going through at this level of detail.